Okay, hello and welcome everybody. This is such a great turnout. Thanks for showing up to come and learn and support. My name is Alicia Jungleward and I am the advisor of the Park High Green Initiative in Livingston, Montana. Welcome to the third installment of this Youth Climate Resiliency series. This whole series sort of stems from the work that the young people here do in Livingston. It was born from a webinar that was put together initially by one of our graduating seniors, and I have been so impressed by what we have been able to put together. This series is in partnership with Resilience Montana, Families for a Livable Climate, the Park County Environmental Council, the University of Montana, and Montana State University. It is through this partnership that Families for a Livable Climate that I am thrilled to introduce you to June Melsna, tonight's moderator. June is currently the Legislative and Organizing Fellow with the Montana chapter of the Sierra Club and a fellow with the National Young Farmers Coalition. She started organizing in 2012 in the fossil fuel divestment and keep it in the ground movements. She gravitated toward solutions rooted on the land through her environmental policy education at MIT, and she was guided in Indigenous leadership. Working in support of Dene, just transition, and sovereignty led her to her first experiences in agriculture, and then to many seasons on Beyond Organic and regenerative farms. June grounds her life as an organizer by tending soil. So now I will turn it over to June. Thank you, June.
Thanks for sharing that whole introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm here to ask the wonderful questions that have been put together for a great panel, and I'm excited to be tied back into youth climate work, which is where I started and organizing. I'm muting myself again. Um, So this is a legislative update with the Montana legislative session just wrapped up. And so wanted to clarify for folks if you don't have the background on the Held versus Montana case and why there are these ties going on between the judicial and the legislature. I've been tracking bills with the Montana Sierra Club since January, and what we saw was legislators bringing in a number of ways, a number of bills, reactions to the Held case. Um, and attempting to respond to it were included these four that I'll briefly mention. Can get a lot more information on through the panel. Um, these are ones that pass. HB 285 repealed or will repeal language that recognizes the Montana Environmental Policy Act as implementing the Montana constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. We have SB 221 coming out of this session, which greatly narrows when the state has to do greenhouse gas analysis. So it's an attempt to make the decision, the Held decision, as weak as possible. There's still being greenhouse gas analysis, but when it's done being narrowed. We also had HB 291 coming out of the session, which disallows Montana from being able to adopt air quality standards that are stricter than federal ones. And then more benign one, we had HB 270, which just strikes language in the Montana Environmental um, Policy Act that the Supreme Court found to be unconstitutional through the Held case. And that language was preventing the state from considering impacts to climate. So there's a lot more detail behind all of those bills and the outlook for them, but I will let our panelists, experts share those. I'm just going to name who we have on the panel, and we're going to start off asking each person one question. So along with that, I'll give more of their background for each person before I ask them a question. But we have Nate Bellinger today from Our Children's Trust. We have Barbara Chilcott from Western Environmental Law Center located in Helena. We have Lance Forstar with the Montana American Indian Caucus, Durf Johnson from the Montana Environmental Information Center, Maddie Greb, who is a senior in Sustainability Science and Practice at UM, also with Montperg. And we have Eva Lighthizer, who's a plaintiff in that landmark held versus Montana case. So I'll start off with a question for Nate. Nate Bellinger is a supervising senior staff attorney for Our Children's Trust, where he has been since the organization's inception, starting as a volunteer in 2010. He is the lead attorney in Held v. State of Montana and the first ever constitutional climate case to go to trial, and won a historic ruling against the state, which has one of the largest reservoirs of fossil fuels in the US. Nate is also the lead counsel in Layla v. Commonwealth of Virginia and is always working to develop new cases. Nate has co-authored several legal articles and has been interviewed for and quoted in numerous national and international media stories. So we want to ask Nate, to start off, could we get a brief overview of the held case, any recent news or updates? And since the ruling, what impacts or ripple effects have you seen legally as well as we're seeing politically here in Montana? Are other states responding? And how can young people leverage that precedent to drive change?
Thank you, June, for that introduction and for all of you being here today. That's a lot to cover in a few minutes, so I'll do my best, but I've got some great panelists following me who can fill in the gaps. And I just want to also thank Barbara from Western Environmental Law Center and McGarvey Law and Roger Sullivan in particular, who were co-counsel on Held case and really pleasure to work with. And of course, Eva and all the other plaintiffs who were awesome. So, I mean, I'm hoping, I expect a lot of you kind of are familiar with Held, so just briefly recap that. But, for those who haven't followed this type of litigation, I mean, it was the first ever constitutional climate trial in our nation's history. So it was really exciting. We had trial in 2023. There are 16 youth plaintiffs, including Eva, suing the state and several agencies. And, the exact conduct evolved a little bit as the case proceeded towards trial. And ultimately, what was tried was the constitutionality of a couple of provisions of MEPA that prohibited the state from looking at greenhouse gas emissions and climate change when issuing permits for fossil fuels, and also restricted the remedies that the court could provide, basically making it so courts couldn't block projects even if there was a deficient MEPA review. So thanks in large part to testimony of Eva and the other plaintiffs and 10 awesome experts, including, looks like the Byrons may be here. Lori Byron was one of our experts and other experts from Montana. We prevailed at trial in 2023, and then following the state's appeal to the Supreme Court, we won there too just this past December. I'm not going to go through the whole decision, but I just want to highlight two main parts, which is for the Montana Supreme Court became the second Supreme Court in the nation to hold that there's a fundamental right to a stable climate system, with Hawaii being the second. So that was a really important part of the ruling. And then the Supreme Court also rejected the main argument, the main defense that the state made, which was, Montana's emissions don't matter, climate change is a global problem. And the state, or the Supreme Court, rejected that, said it doesn't matter what other countries, other states are doing. Montana has a duty to protect its citizens from its conduct that is making climate change worse. So really, really exciting decision. The decision has been called the strongest ruling on climate change ever issued by any court in the world. So really having implications well beyond Montana. One of those that I'll just touch on is, so we had another case in Hawaii that was about to go to trial last summer. And shortly before that case went to trial, the defendants there came to us and they decided to settle the case. And I think what was happening was they saw what happened in Montana. They knew they wouldn't be able to win once all the evidence and the expert and plaintiff testimony came out in court. So they decided to settle the case, which is great. They have committed to decarbonizing their transportation sector by 2045, and that will be supervised by court. So that was one really immediate effect of the held trial and ruling. I think now that we have the Supreme Court ruling in particular, we'll start to see that relied on in other states as well. Some people think, well, it's Montana specific, and it is to some degree, but I think what we really need is more judges, stepping up, showing the courage to do the right thing. And I think the decisions in Montana will provide that roadmap. And, there's really important findings of fact in the decision that can be persuasive in other states as well. I think, a couple points to just emphasize about the decision is the court made clear that, right now, today, there is already an unconstitutional level of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and that every additional ton of pollution exacerbates those climate injuries, further harms the plaintiffs. So what that really means is that Montana cannot continue to take actions that increase greenhouse gas emissions and needs to really start decarbonizing, right now. And we presented evidence and got great findings about the technical feasibility of that, the economic benefits, how it will save money, create jobs. So there's really no reason not to be doing that. And I hope that that's what will start to happen, although I realize there's been quite a bit of pushback in the legislature, which I will I think I'll let some of the other panelists speak to the reactions, but really excited to see how the held case turned out, both in district court in Montana, and I think there's a lot to work with in those opinions that will be really important findings for future cases, both in Montana and outside of Montana. And I will leave it at that for now.
All right, thank you for that intro to the case. We're gonna segue with a question to Barbara Chilcott. They'll ask both about the case that you're also involved with and about how, from your perspective, legislators are responding. So I do want to share everyone's bio. Barbara Chilcott is a senior attorney with the Western Environmental Law Center's Northern Rockies office in Helena, Montana. Originally from South Carolina, Barbara earned a BA in economics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her law degree from University of Montana School of Law. Prior to joining WELC in 2021, Barbara served as legal director for the Clark Fork Coalition, an attorney for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. At WELC, she works primarily on climate and energy-related litigation, and she served on the legal team representing the 16 youth plaintiffs in Held v. Montana, which secured the constitutional right to a stable climate system for Montanans. So from your perspective, how are lawmakers responding to the held decision in shaping or resisting climate-related policy? And then can you talk a little bit about the role that public engagement and testimony has played through the course of the case and potential future cases?
Sure. Thanks, June, for the introduction, and thanks so much to Park County Environmental Council and families for inviting me. I love sitting on a panel with Nate and Durf and Eva, and it's just pretty fun to be a part of this kind of team as we go forward. So I think, Nate did a great job of kind of summarizing the held case and kind of what we achieved. there. And as folks might kind of gather from June's introduction, the legislature, rather than kind of using the decision and held as kind of a springboard or seeing it as a mandate to move more quickly or move at all on advancing climate policy, the majority in the legislature really continued to evade their responsibility under the Constitution to take steps to address climate impacts on Montanans. So, on the one hand, as Nate described, the Held decision, it's inspired so many to take action to advance climate justice here in Montana, across the country, globally even. But also here in Montana, that our case catalyzed lawmakers, the governor, DEQ, which takes its orders from the governor, to really bend over backwards this past session to pass bills that attempt to undermine kind of the judicial decision we received and held. And so you'll hear from Durf in a minute about kind of the specific mechanics of how these the bills that specifically amended MEPA kind of were intended to undermine the decision. But as June mentioned, there's also a bill that passed that amends Montana's Clean Air Act that basically prohibits the state or local government from regulating greenhouse gas emissions unless the federal government does it first. So, I guess, in summary, the legislature really kind of dug their heels in. And, I share Nate's optimism that we're going to get there in Montana, but this backlash, I think, is not surprising. I think there's always going to be a response in this way. But I do think we still have tools in our toolbox to keep moving forward, and Held is an excellent foundation to kind of move forward from. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about there were really brave legislators who also brought good bills to advance climate policy, including one bill that would have required DEQ to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that did not pass this session, but it was just a good example of, how we can kind of start, keep bringing these types of policy to the legislature, and eventually we're going to continue to make progress. So I think the other part of your question, June, about the importance of testimony and public engagement, that bill in particular, House Bill 291, that was a really good example because that bill, the hearing for that was held on the same day that families organized the Climate Advocacy Day. And it was really cool to be in the room with so many of you here on this Zoom and others testifying, providing, sharing your stories on why the legislature should require the state to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and start taking action on climate change. So, those stories that, you all tell in front of legislative committees really are what change hearts and minds of policymakers. So I think, to your question, that's really important. And I'd say from a litigation standpoint, I'll just point out that judges are people too, and they pay attention to what is going on in the world. There was a decision that the Montana Supreme Court issued after its decision in the upholding our win in the Held case, where they looked at an environmental review for a gas plant in Laurel, Montana, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And, I'm not going to go into detail on that decision, but for our purposes, what I really want to highlight is that the court, several times in that decision, noted that DEQ received over 700 comments on its environmental review for that project, and those commenters were concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. And so the court, in that case, reaffirmed that MEPA's purpose is to inform not just like the legislature or public officials, but also the public of project impacts within their communities. And so it just kind of reaffirms that we all deserve to know the true environmental impacts of these projects. And so it's really important for the public to engage and ask questions. And so the last thing I would say is I think sometimes it can feel kind of intimidating to testify in front of a legislative committee, it's kind of like not a natural way to communicate with anyone, and it sometimes feels a little like inhumane. And many of you do it a lot. So, and I also think writing public comments on technical environmental documents might seem overwhelming. But I just want to highlight there are resources out there to help. The organizations represented here, whether it's families or Sierra Club or Park County Environmental Council, MEIC, those groups really work hard to help the public kind of connect you all with resources to engage and to really uplift your voices. So, and also, I guess to put in a plug for my job, it makes my job easier as a lawyer for organizations to have kind of a large group of members who work to advance climate justice. And so every case we bring to challenge an unlawful government action and to advance good policy requires that our clients demonstrate that they have what's called standing. And basically that they have an interest in this activity or this decision, and that will be harmed by whatever this bad thing is that the government's doing. So our client groups are able to establish standing through their members, and the stories that those members can bring to litigation are really what make a case successful. So just like we saw in Eva's story and the stories of her co-plaintiffs, that's what made our case successful. And so I know we're all looking for ways to make a difference right now in these kind of chaotic times. So I think that's, in terms of the importance of engaging and testimony and things like that. I think I would encourage folks to find ways to do that, and because your stories matter. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, I'd uplift again that organizations here can help bring people into the fold where that first time that you contribute in the legislative session is very intimidating. And organizations are here to facilitate that. And then I really liked how you laid out how that testimony matters in more ways than one. Even if that bill still ends up passing, all that you've built underneath of that, the movement, the standing, the comment, the tide that happens along with that. We've are tight in all of our bounty of panelists to have about 5 minutes for each one to answer a single question before turning to audience questions. So I'm going to move right along to Lance Forstar. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Let me get into a place I can talk. Good evening. My name is Lance Forster. Howdaguchia, Makani Tantramagyab, Hudeshana Jamachano Tabecho Akban Wati. My Assiniboine name is Shake the Ground. I belong to the Red Bottom clan of the Assiniboine Nation. I'm here in Havre. We just got done with the legislative recap for a couple legislators. The drive over was great. I think that it's great to be here today, and I've been decompressing since the session. It wasn't as bad as last session. I think this is my second session as the director of the Montana American Indian Caucus, and I'm just really glad that I can actually speak freely, because as the director, as a legislative staffer, they'll put a gag on me when it comes to speaking to the press or being on a panel or anything like that. So, and I actually was able to file as a candidate again for House District 31, and it's just great to look forward to running for the 70th legislative session, and I'm just really happy that 30 people are on this call. I did get an opportunity to speak to during the Climate Action Day. I had a prepared speech that I'd written in the middle of the night, and I think that I would put people on notice that the world that we live in is we're passing it on to generations of people that have no choice but to live with our decisions and or indecisions, and that they are inheriting a world that that will be almost terrible, if not impossible, to avoid any of the 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 effects of climate change with our carbon dioxide content in the Earth's atmosphere, and just a myriad of, I know I'm speaking to the choir, but there's just a myriad of challenges and complications that come with working with people who are very short-sighted on working towards green solutions, and it really is. It's really tough to work in that atmosphere. It's really toxic. So I got to go to a good sweat on Monday night, and I really burned. I hadn't been to a good sweat all session, so I came home to Fort Peck. I live on the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux Reservation. I'm here with Senator Jonathan Windy Boy and Mark Cook with the Wolves of the Rockies, our Indian caucus members. There's 12 Indian caucus members. I was the director, and we've been successful at passing just about every piece of legislation that we introduced. And I just think that our approach is very effective. We've been able to work across the aisle and get support on both sides to get our legislation passed. And we almost became too effective because they had silenced me and giving testimony on behalf of the caucus about halfway through during the break. So if you had seen me testifying, then all of a sudden wonder what happened to me, that was the cost of being too effective in my testimony, or maybe not. I don't know, but I'm just really glad to be able to speak freely now, and hopefully I can stay that way.
We appreciate you being there so much in that environment, and imagine with my only limited exposure to the legislative session, I can only imagine the level of decompression that's happening right now. Thank you for introducing yourself. And so that was a much better introduction than I would have given. I have a question though.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We're wondering key concerns or goals that you're seeing coming from tribal nations in Montana related to climate and environmental policy. This session in particular, how were those reflected or not in the legislation that ended up coming about?
Well, I think, shadowing Senator Jonathan Windy Boy, it was about 20 years ago that he had introduced the guiding principles for tribal consultation between the state and tribal nations here in Montana. So amongst that, those guiding principles, it basically includes including tribal voices and governments when it comes to anything that affects a tribe. So some of the challenges in legislation, and you wouldn't be surprised, or you would be surprised that when it comes to something that's environmentally unsound, or it's could be detrimental to future generations, like the uranium enrichment plant down in Colstrip. Down in Colstrip, the situation there is that the coal plant there is scheduled to be closed, and once it's closed, I believe it will be designated a Brownsfield. It'll get Brownsfield designation for its level of contamination, and once that designation occurs, the EPA can start cleaning it up. It'll become a Superfund site. But so the powers that be, they see this opportunity to turn the facility into a uranium enrichment or uranium disposal plant, I believe. So Representative Suptis down there at wasn't aware of some of the bills that were occurring. So it's like the first thing they do is create this entity within the state to deal with nuclear energy, and then the next step is to start introducing a series of pieces of legislation that eventually works towards putting this uranium waste disposal system there, and under the dialogue or the narrative that eventually there will be small modular reactors that don't exist yet, that are maybe 10, 15 years down the line. And when I'm asked by people what's the problem with nuclear energy, and you know, for every when we look at the different types of um, energy, I think that nuclear is probably the cleanest when it comes to emissions and contamination and everything like that. But at the end of the day, it could be probably the dirtiest as well, because when you look at the traditional nuclear reactors and nuclear power plants, they only use a certain percentage of the uranium, and there's nuclear waste that is produced, which has to stay on site. So, and it will stay on site for the lifetime of its of the isotopes. I believe that when you look at that, you're looking at generations and generations and generations of people within the area, and especially downstream from this area. That if there was a leak, it would go into the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and potentially the Crow Reservation. So when we leave out the voices of the Northern Cheyenne tribes and the Crow tribes, um, and there is no consultation, then you're effectively poisoning a group of tribal members, a tribe or tribes that have no say in the matter, and that's an environmental injustice. And when we look at a lot of the environmental justices, like the Dakota Access Pipeline, which eventually was built, and the reaction from water protectors such as myself, and um, we learned some important lessons from that. So like there's groups now that will be called to action. Currently, we have a small handful of people within the Montana American Indian movement that came to give opposition um, to these bills, these nuclear bills, uranium bills. And I believe, other than Nick with MEIC, we were the only people. There might have been one other person. I think Jade Barr with the um, former representative Jade Barr had also been able to give opposition. But other than those three individuals, um, there wasn't much opposition because they kept it quiet. And so when it came to the floor, and there wasn't too much opposition, and it just kind of got pushed through, and now we're at this point where the Northern Cheyenne um, tribes are trying to do what they can to be at the table with this. And they should have been consulted at the very beginning, and I think that there's potentially a lot of lawsuits, and it just um, the future of consultation really needs to be worked on. It's the law is already there. The through Senator Jonathan Windyboy's the guiding principles, but it's everything needs to be really improved. And I think that's one of our major fights, and for the environmental impacts. But even at the end of the session, between all the controversy, when people were being hauled out for Zoe Zephyr's stance during during the end of the session, like without much fanfare or attention, the entire state of Montana state legislature had passed a resolution in full support of the Keystone XL pipeline, and the 24,000 clean water drinkers in Northeast Montana that benefit from the Assiniboine and Sioux rural water supply system um, absolutely need clean water. And the highly carcinogenic tar sand bitumen dilute, that benzene diluted mixture that was going to be uh, funneled through the Keystone XL pipeline, if it had become if there was a leak, it would get into our water supply, and it would affect all of us. So it just that's one of our main concerns, and it always comes down to just probably a handful of us that really stand up. But there's a lot of concerns about like the people that do stand up, the activists that stand up against environmental atrocities, there's always the threat of law enforcement. There's a threat of being under surveillance um, at every level. And I know that state and tribal law enforcement had undergone trainings to deal with a huge reaction to the Keystone XL pipeline, up to the point where we're like, I was advised by the ACLU director that if I feel like there's a like that feeling on the back of my neck that I'm under surveillance, to let them know. But it kind of comes with the territory, so it's unfortunate. But we also have a lot of big challenges with any type of energy project that you bring in man counts, and these are people that are unvetted, coming from around the country into our communities that are pretty isolated, like Northeast Montana, and these people could potentially be sex offenders, and they could prey upon our our vulnerable people, and it's happened quite a bit. So with the missing and murdered Indigenous people efforts, we have a lot of activists that are finding solutions. Um, so like right now, I'm in good standing and working with the Drug Enforcement Agency to administration um, to set up license plate readers at the borders of our reservation and other reservations to stop human trafficking and fentanyl and methamphetamine coming onto our reservation. So that's part of the work that I do. I'm going to run for office. If I don't get in, then I'm still going to do what I do.
Thank you. Yeah, we know the patterns that extractive and hazardous industries have disproportionate impact on tribal nations, and in tracking bills, including the nuclear bill this session, it was particularly insulting that an amendment came up to at least put a check for tribal nations to have some say over waste sites and milling that was proximate to them, but then that amendment was taken back. So feel for that very much. We are running a little behind time. We've got 3 more panelists that I still want to ask a first question to. And if you're coming up with questions, audience, that you're wanting to ask right after these speakers are talking, if you would put that in the chat as we go, and we'll see what we can get to, or definitely continue conversation. Durf, I've got a question for you next. So if you don't know, Durf Johnson is a deputy director. Is that supposed to say of Montana Environmental Information Center? A policy advocate, attorney, lobbyist, and works to address the climate crisis by holding the fossil fuel industry accountable to the transition, the energy system, and to transition the energy system to cleaner sources. Durf is also the staff lead on MEIC's hard rock mining program and leads the Save Our Smith campaign. I'll leave it at that for your description. Durf has definitely been tracking these bills that have been responses to the Held v. Montana case in the legislative session this year. And so we want to ask, can you explain how MEPA has changed this session at the end of the day coming out, and what those changes mean for public participation and climate environmental justice going forward?
Yeah. So again, my name is Durf Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Montana Environmental Information Center. And it's nice to see my friend Lance. Hopefully I'll see you up again in the Capitol in 27. I am a full-time lobbyist during the legislative session. And so I'm up there day in and day out working on a variety of different bills. And that ranges everything from coal to oil and gas to hard rock mining to public participation, and of course MEPA. So I worked quite a bit on MEPA, and unfortunately, these 4 bills I'm going to talk about, 3 bad ones, 1 relatively good one, were all baked before they even arrived at the legislature. There was not much we could do in the way of getting amendments on or stopping them. And that's pretty typical, unfortunately, with the legislature for certain issues. And so there was a pretty strong reaction to the held opinion at the legislature, as you can imagine. The Republican majority really went after the ruling in a variety of different ways. So I'm going to run through these, try and keep it big picture as much as I can without being too wonky here. And thank you for Paul for dropping the links to these bills in. You can go and read them yourself if you'd like. But the first one I want to touch on is SB 221, because I think this is probably the most important of the four pieces of legislation. This was sponsored by Senator Wiley Galt. He is from central Montana. And what it would do is basically in a full climate analysis, you would consider the full range of potential emissions that may be occurring from a particular project that is authorized from the government, by the government. What this bill would do is limit the government's analysis to only those emissions that are included within the what I like to call the fence line of a particular permit. And so if you have, for example, and I'm going to use this as an example, but it's a real world example, a coal mine that is mining coal, and in the process of mining that coal generates diesel emissions and uses a certain amount of electricity, etc. You're only going to evaluate the under 221, which is now law, the emissions that resulted from, the trucks, etc., that are operating to mine that coal. And that may be, in this real world example, 14,000 tons of emissions associated with mining that coal. What you're not going to do under this bill or be prohibited from doing is evaluating the downstream impacts of combusting that coal, wherever it may be. And in the example I'm using for Signal Peak expansion, that would have been roughly 24 million tons of emissions. And so what they're attempting to do is to really, really narrow the potential evaluation of impacts so that they can make it look like it's not that big of a deal, when in fact, all that coal is going to be used for is for combustion for electricity in Montana. So they try to really narrow that analysis to just those immediate on-site impacts, and that will unfortunately really depress the numbers in terms of what the state's actually authorizing. And it also prevents some other analyses that normally would have been required, such as reasonably foreseeable analysis. The second and really important bill is HB 285, and this is by Representative Brandon Lair. He's a representative from out east. And the major thing that this bill does that relevant to this discussion is every piece of environmental legislation that I'm aware of in Montana has this preamble in it that basically says, well, we're enacting this to do this. And the legislature, mindful of our duty under Montana's Constitution, enacts this particular piece of legislation. And so they're basically constitutionalizing the legislation, making it so that it satisfies the legislature's constitutional duty. What this bill does is it strikes that language. And what they're attempting to do is to basically make it so that decisions under MEPA are not subject to constitutional review, which is a much more strict standard under the law in terms of what the state needs to consider and how hard they need to evaluate and whether there's exceptions that are allowed. And so that's their attempt. I'm not sure they're going to be successful, but they would like to make it a purely procedural law and not contain any substance. So we're basically just going through the process of evaluating particular projects under the Montana Environmental Policy Act and not allowing for any substantive decision making or any teeth in the law under HB 285. HB 291, Barbara mentioned this, but basically it was sponsored by Representative Oblander from Billings. And what it does is it prevents the state from adopting any air quality regulation that is more stringent than federal standards. And why that's important is because we don't have a federal standard for carbon regulation. And so the state will be prevented under this bill if it, were to go into effect and be ruled legal. The state would be prevented from mitigating or regulating carbon, even though we have this constitutional provision. That's the intent of this bill. Unfortunately, it's problematic because right now it's somewhat rare actually that we go above air quality standards at the state level, go above federal standards. And the one time we did it, it was a really important thing dealing with mercury emission standards, and we addressed some the federal government was failing to take action. And so there's lots of reasons why the state would want to step out and have a more strict standard at the state level. But the intent here is really to just cut the state off at the knees from being able to do anything on carbon because the federal government hasn't. And then the last one is HB 270. And this is a bill that was sponsored by Representative Katie Zolnikov. I should say all of these bills are sponsored by Republicans. All of them have been signed into law at this point. Representative Zolnikov's bill, I would say on balance, perhaps a good bill. I think that the main thing is that it addressed some remedies issues that were problematic that were put into place before Held B in Montana and then ruled to be unconstitutional. And so it clarifies some of the legal procedures that are associated with remedies. And when I say remedies, I mean the part of the litigation that when a judge decides after ruling on something, say he gives you a win, and then he decides how he's going to let you win. Is he going to stop the project? Is he going to order a new analysis? And or her. And so what this bill does is it primarily brings state code into conformance with what Held said in terms of remedy. And so we ended up supporting this bill throughout the process, even though it was part of these larger package of bills. So that's the big rundown. And if you want to learn more, Paul just dropped in a list of them, and you can also visit our website at meic.org, where I believe that the first three, HB 291, 285, and 221, we've scorecarded them. And so you can see how your legislator voted on each one of these bills, et cetera. And that's on our website. So thank you, Joan, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and MAIC does a really good job of writing down summaries of all these things. So I'm sure that can all be found at the website going forward. We want to hear from Maddie Greb. So Maddie Greb is a rising senior in sustainability science and practice at UM. She spent her intern semester organizing a panel event to engage community members with a local Superfund site in Missoula. She looks forward to spending the next year as a Montpurg board member and keeping students informed and empowered to support positive change for conservation. So we want to ask about that student engagement. Our question for you is, can you share some of the ways you and other students have been getting involved during this legislative session? Were there any particular bills you were watching, and how did you engage with them? Were they these ones that Durf just laid out, or other ones? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try to keep it brief because I know we're crunching on time. But yeah, so fundamentally, my goals as well as Montpurg's was just to get students engaged with the legislative session and give them that sense of empowerment that their voice does matter. So Montpurg is a nonpartisan organization. So we focus on issues rather than parties. I know we all understand the attacks on conservation during this session. So that was a big focus, but we also focused on just like consumer protections and pro-democracy work, especially with some of the bills that came up that would revise like the qualifications for students to be registered to vote in Montana. Montperg also helped organize students to attend events like Climate Advocacy Day and the I Love the Constitution rally, which some of our interns and board members were featured on the New York Times article. Yeah, a lot of the bills that we focused on, both with Montperg and then also externally, just on campus, with like the Climate Response Club, were already mentioned, like House Bill 270, 291. But some of the other ones that we focused a lot on were Senate Bill 188, which was the one to revise, or implement community shared solar programs. We also focused on Senate Bill 294, which was Andrea Olson's bill, I believe. And then some big ones that we focused on that we were lobbying for were House Bills 477 and 307. House Bill 477 has caused quite the stir all across Montana with fully bipartisan support until it reached the governor's desk. I don't know if you've all seen the video of him with his styrofoam cup. Yeah, and then House Bill 307 which would have reallocated funds generated through marijuana tax revenue away from conservation. So those were the ones that we focused on, and we had 18 student interns between the Missoula and Bozeman locations that were lobbying on campus and off campus, attending those events. We also had a legislative fellow this session who was in Helena for the whole semester, I guess the whole session, just keeping track of different bills and sitting on hearings and testifying. A big project that our interns worked on was there were 5 different legislative workshops throughout the session, and that was to bring students and community members together just to be more engaged and informed with what was going on surrounding those aforementioned issues. There were over 115 public comments that our interns collected and submitted on different bills during the session. Again, we had over 50 public testimonies. We submitted 15 letters to the editor, which were submitted to news publications across the whole state. And then we organized 6 lobby days to bring students from our and Bozeman offices to the state capitol to directly lobby on consumer and environmental protections and voting rights. But there were a few other bills that we also focused on, again, just within that scope, and just looking at them through the nonpartisan lens of just the issue. And it was really exciting to see so many students engaged with the session. I'm also a member of the Climate Response Club, and we lobbied for a lot of the same bills. We collected over 50 signatures for like Senate Bill 307 and House Joint Resolution 24. So yeah, just a lot of students coming together, taking the stand to support conservation and stand against anti-conservation legislation.
Thank you. Good to hear there's all that activity. And I'm wondering if we want to see those op-eds that were written or get a write-up of the bills you were focusing on, where would we go for that?
I can send you an email from Sophie, the regional director, or I can just list them out. There's like 10 of them.
Oh, okay. There's not a
I'll put them in the chat.
collection. I was kind of asking for the for the audience something we could click on and see op-ed links or something, but
I'll try to find one before this is up.
cool. Thank you. We are coming up on our time in 2 minutes. I really don't want to rush the last panelist, Eva Lighthizer, with this big question that we have for her. So I'd like to just give the time for that. And then I'm thinking, tell me how this sounds to folks, that at that time, once we pass 8 o'clock, whoever wants to go, panelists can go about their evening. If people want to stick around and take some questions from those who are here or have it back and forth, then they can stick around. So with that, Eva, I want to introduce Eva, who is a plaintiff in the landmark lawsuit held v. Montana that is so acclaimed in this panel right now, and partners frequently with the Green Initiative on Climate Advocacy. She was recognized as USA Today's Woman of the Year in Montana and enjoys writing and spending time in all the wild places surrounding Livingston. So we've heard a lot of heavy things about the session, and in that light, kind of wanted to ask Eva about living with the work. You're living with being deep in this work, and so in the fight for climate justice, it can be emotionally exhausting, especially when progress is slow or setbacks happen. And the last event in this series focused on that, coping with eco-anxiety and supporting mental health as it relates to climate. But can you share a bit about the emotions that were at play through the course of going through the trial, how that evolved over time, especially with all the shifts that have happened since that trial began? And do you have any resilience strategies once youth start to get involved in making change and are riding along with that?
Thank you so much for introducing me, June. To jump right in, I often describe the trial experience as kind of like an emotional roller coaster. It was so incredibly exciting to be part of something that had never happened before in our nation's history. And I think one of my absolute favorite parts about the trial experience was getting to walk up to the courthouse every day and seeing all of these supporters cheering all of us plaintiffs on. And that was like really incredibly special. So I think there was all sorts of, excitement in the air during the trial experience. And despite that, I was incredibly nervous to testify, especially when I found out on the first day of trial that my testimony had been moved up to that same day due to the fact that proceedings were moving a little bit faster than anticipated. So even though my hands were kind of like shaking and I was a nervous wreck taking the stand, I think something kind of clicked when I did sit down in the middle of that courtroom and began telling my story. It didn't seem as intimidating or as frightening once I started speaking about, experiencing flooding on the Yellowstone River in 2022, or the wildfire smoke that permeates the air every summer here now, or talking about the mental health impacts that I've experienced due to the climate crisis. And after testifying, those nerves were gone and I was really able to kind of dive into the rest of the proceedings. It was so interesting getting to hear from the expert witnesses who came from all different areas, such as climate science, glacier science, children's health and psychology, economists. We also had the first person who testified in the trial was Maynann Ellingson, who was the youngest constitutional delegate present at the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention, which implemented the language clean and healthful into our Constitution. And that was really, really incredible. It was also so cool getting to hear from my co-plaintiffs about their own experiences and all the good work they were doing within the climate activism world. And it was also, I think difficult in some ways because, hearing about the climate impacts they'd faced was heavy and it kind of weighed on us all, which kind of brings me to the point of, it's so important that we use our voices like this because, you can't deny us a lived experience. And so it was just really, really a crazy whirlwind of emotions, an incredible experience. But yeah, I think one of the biggest things I learned throughout this entire experience of being in Helping Montana and the years that have followed has been the fact that there's so much power in our voices as youth. And it's really, really incredible to see just how much your voice can make an effect. In the beginning of this, I don't think I really truly believed that my voice could have an impact. I think that was partially why I was so nervous about testifying, because I think I was worried about what if I don't have anything worthwhile to say. But I think to reiterate what has been said, I think a few times in this past hour, is that every story matters and everyone's voice matters. So I would really just, yeah, always reiterate that it is so important to use your voice, and that you can get involved locally and you can speak up in so many different ways.
Thank you very much, Eva, from your direct experience. So we will let people slide out if they have plans for their evening after 8:04. But opening up the floor now to questions to anybody, any of the panelists. Panelists have questions for each other.
Got a question for Durf. Are you still on there?
Yep.
What can we do is some of our activists and people from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, what can we do? Where does the development with the uranium, where does that stand right now, and what can we do as a community and Native people in Montana and across the nation?
Well, I think the first thing is to just get loud about it. And I think it's unfortunate that they decided to roll over the MAIC over the ability to just decide whether or not nuclear storage, nuclear waste storage was something that you wanted near in your community. So I think that that is still something that we should be pushing in 2027. And I think that, like you said, we didn't have a strong opposition, and I think part of it was because people are still trying to figure out what this nuclear stuff is, and part of it's that a lot of our tribal communities, it's a long way to travel for them to get to Helena. So I think that we need to think about 2027 and getting people engaged to at least address that. And I think we have a little bit of time. Because this nuclear stuff is a ways off if we ever proceed with it. It's really sort of an unproven technology, and it's incredibly expensive. And so I think organizing on something in 2027 to prepare for it and educating people in the communities on the reservations is going to be really important. So I'm happy to work with you on that, Lance. And as you know, Nick is really our guy
Okay.
on nuclear, but I'm happy to jump in as well.
Okay. Thank you, Durf.
In the chat, we have people absorbing the sharing that Eva did and wondering a little bit more about power in our voices. Does that inspire a comment from you?
Yeah, I think I feel like one of the hardest things about kind of using your voice is finding where to use it, and where to take action and where to kind of focus your energy. And I think that one of the most important things you can do in the world of climate activism is find out what's either happening on your level or what you can do to start things happening on your level. And that's on your like community level. What can you do for your local community, your neighborhood, your school, the people you surround yourself with? And I think that your voice can start in a very small place and it can grow from there. I think I like to use the Green Initiative as an example because they went from a recycling club that started back in, I think, 2017, and now they're, organizing a second youth climate summit. And so that is so like incredibly cool and a great example of like how you can start in a really small place and then continue to use your voices and grow from there. And I think another thing that I also constantly reiterate is the importance of your own mental health within all of this. It is incredibly distressing and difficult to see, the constant negative headlines, to see firsthand, climate impacts all around you. So I think it's important to take care of yourself so that you can take care of others and take care of your planet.
Another question in the chat. Seems like Jerf is maybe the one to answer this one, or if other people have answers to this question. Robin and Beth are wondering what effect the laws that attempt to undercut held versus state of Montana have, and what can be done about that. What I personally read into this question a little bit is it can be laid out what the law says, and then there's speculation about what is going to follow from that. Will it hold, etc., like that. So what effects will it have and what can be done?
I think that Barbara should answer this question. Might be a little more in your wheelhouse, Barbara, because I'm assuming that litigation is going to be part of this.
Thanks, Durf. I assume you will also be a part of that conversation. Yeah, I think, we have three branches of government for a reason. And, we're seeing this at the federal level where, neither Congress nor the executive are really kind of concerned with following the Constitution. And then the courts have, in many cases, thankfully stepped in. And so I think, that's certainly what we're considering for these MIPA bills. I think we have, which would be a court challenge to the lawfulness of those bills under the Constitution, because no matter what what language the legislature strikes from MIPA or any other statute, it still holds that the legislature has a constitutional obligation to protect a clean and healthful environment in Montana. And so the they can't just undo that or ignore that obligation. And so if MIPA doesn't fulfill that obligation, then they need to do it some other way. And it doesn't appear that they are seeing it that way. So the other, I guess, part of that is we already kind of know a lot, I think, of how DEQ is going to look at climate impacts or not look at them going forward. We have some MIPA environmental reviews that have come out recently and really have super bare bones greenhouse gas and climate analysis, kind of along the lines that Durf talked about, that the legislation that passed would require, such a very narrow scope within the fence line of a project. So we've seen kind of what that would look like, and it just doesn't adequately describe, like MIPA. As the Montana Supreme Court said, the whole point of MIPA is to inform the public about environmental impacts that happen in their communities. And so, the legislature has an obligation to do that. And that's kind of the job of the courts, to make sure that they follow the Constitution. So stay tuned.
It's not over yet. Yeah.
Wow, that
What other
was,
questions, conversation?
yeah, I was just gonna say, like, that was such a powerful conversation from everybody. Such amazing input. I appreciate all of you, Nate, Barbara, Lance, Durf, Maddie, Eva. Like, wow, like we are so lucky to have all of you. We were lucky that you like I'm just blown away at how this 3-part series has really turned out. I appreciate all of you for showing up. What a wealth of knowledge. Thank you, Robin and Beth, that answered that question. They were drivers of this as well. Thank you for all of our partners that helped put this together. Thank you for this one specifically, Families for a Livable Climate. And then, yeah, Eva, thank you for giving a plug to to the second 2025 Youth Climate Summit. If anybody here wants to participate in that, reach out to me or anybody at Park County Environmental Council. June, thank you for being our moderator for the evening. If nobody has any last questions, we'll get out of here 15 minutes late. Sorry. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Have a
Bye.
nice evening, everyone.
Thank
Happy
you. Thanks for
spring.
joining us.
Thank you.